Hi, today we're talking about the FBI's famous 1986 Miami-Dade shootout. Recently I did a presentation comparing the 9x19 to the 40 Smith & Wesson. The subject came up, people asked for my analysis on it, so here we are. Now this subject comes with a laundry list of caveats, disclaimers, and yabbits, including you're going to have to put up with my Shatner-esque pauses and my very annoying habit of transposing letters and syllables. Also, everything I tell you today is based on my education, my knowledge, my training, my experience, and the resource materials available to me. And resource materials don't always agree with each other. Also, all the opinions I have are just that, my opinions, and they're based on my training, my experience. Different people have different experiences, so they have different opinions. Now there's one other thing, bear with me. Obviously, I was not there on that day in 1986, so the question comes up, who am I to tell you anything about it? And that's a fair question. And who I am is this. In the late 1980s, I was a combat marksmanship instructor at the Marine Corps Security Forces School. This was right after Miami-Dade happened, and it was a big influence on the training I received and the training I conducted. We got a lot of training materials, books, and videos and so forth directly from the FBI. I took a lot of classes on it. I taught the class on it. I even had the opportunity to attend in person a 2-day FBI seminar on the subject. I'm familiar with the event. Okay, that having been said, let's get on with it. There's a few law enforcement shootings that I would consider required reading for anybody who takes firearms training seriously as it applies to concealed carry, personal protection, security, or law enforcement work. And Miami-Dade is at the top of that list. And I want to explain why I consider it so important. Law enforcement firearms selection and firearms training kind of goes along on a path that doesn't deviate very much. And then about every 10 or 20 years, there's a highly publicized law enforcement shooting, usually one where the police get the short end of the stick, that drastically changes the direction that firearms selection and firearms training is going. Miami-Dade is one of them. And there's others too, and there's others that are important, but this one is one I consider the most important. And the best way to illustrate that is, let me back up about 15 years from that to another event known as the Newhall shooting. Now, the Newhall shooting took place in 1970, and you may recall in an earlier presentation I said 1971. We'll come back to that. Now, the very short version of the Newhall shooting is that the police got a call, man with a gun menacing someone or some people. They go out there, it turns out there's 2 suspects, and in a shootout that lasted about 1 minute, 2 suspects killed 4 police officers and then made their escape. They were captured later, but that's the really short version of what happened. And that's one of those events that shocked the world of law enforcement and changed the direction that training was going. But where that's really applicable is, there's a particular part of the Newhall shooting that is very important in what I'm trying to explain. And please watch this segment in its entirety because there's a punchline at the end. Now, when the Newhall shooting happened, most police officers carried revolvers, and this was before the widespread use of speed loaders. They either had cartridge loops or what were called dump pouches, where you pop it open and just dump all 6 rounds into your hand for reloading. Well, I don't have those, but I have a pocket full of rounds, and that'll suffice to make the point. Now, one of the police officers at the Newhall shooting, armed with a .38 special revolver, similar to this one, fired 6 shots. Then dumped his empty casings into his hand, put them in his pocket because that was the habit he'd picked up on the range so he didn't have to pick up his brass, ducked behind a car, and started reloading. While he was reloading, one of the suspects charged him, shot him point blank, killed him. Based on that one event, on that one day, it changed the direction law enforcement firearms training went. Now, when my father was a police officer in the 1970s, I got to go to the range and watch them shoot for qualification a couple of times. Very educational. And one of the drills they did was a partial reload drill, and it looked like this. Dump the empties onto the ground, get your dump pouch out, load just 2, drop the rest, and shoot those 2. The idea was that loading those 2 and getting those 2 shots off quickly was under some conditions better than taking the time to load all 6. Now let's take a look at the target. Now I was firing from 15 yards and I shot 14 shots and there's 7 hits on each target. And granted, no one's shooting back at me, but the 15 yards is also about double the distance of the Newhall shooting. And now here's the punchline. That partial reload drill was part of the training that my dad received. Years later, it was part of the training that I received. It's been part of the training that I've conducted. But today, I'm reading online sources where people who say that they were part of the Newhall investigation are now claiming that that 6 empty casings in the pocket thing never happened. We have based a great deal of time and effort and training on something that's very possibly fiction. And because it was not documented completely, we'll never really know for sure. And that's the problem with a lot of these things, is documentation. There are so many different versions of the Newhall shooting that some sources don't even agree on what year it happened. Which, by the way, it was 1970. I was able to find a newspaper article and read the date on it. And that is what makes Miami-Dade so important, is because it was so well documented. It's one of the best, if not the best, documented law enforcement shooting there ever was. And so when we analyze what went right and what went wrong, we're making that analysis of things that probably really happened. When we take that and select tasks for training, we conduct that training. It's based on things that probably really happened. Now, the second reason that Miami-Dade is so important is also based on documentation. Because it was so well documented, the story does not change over the years. It's not perfect. The story has changed a little. But for the most part, it does not change over the years. Now, for example, what I mean is, in the early 1930s, when the FBI caught up with and killed John Dillinger, we all know the story of the lady in red and so forth. Well, I don't mean nitpicky details like she was actually wearing orange, which she was, but that's not really important. But at the time, the story was the FBI was heroes, they captured public enemy #1, hooray for them. But as the decades go by and the pendulum swings and it becomes fashionable to dislike and distrust authority figures, especially law enforcement personnel, then stories start getting told about how they shot Dillinger in the back, that he was unarmed at the time, that he was in fact trying to surrender and they murdered him anyway. Now, did any of those things happen? Probably not. But we cannot 100% rule them out due to just a lack of documentation. And so the story changes over the years, and for the most part, Miami-Dade does not. Now, the third reason why it's so important is based on a faction of the public that I call the what-if brigade. These are the people that sit around debating the virtues of a 17-shot versus a 15-shot magazine. These are the people that feel the need to do concealed carry and have 50 rounds on them. These are the people that say you shouldn't just carry a backup gun, but 2 backup guns, and on and on and on. The reality is, in real shootings, to reload is rare. To reload twice is all but unheard of. And although backup guns have saved people's lives, they are rarely deployed. But in the Miami-Dade shooting, those kind of things did occur. Backup guns were deployed. There were people that used up 2 complete magazines and needed a 3rd. All that stuff we talk about, what if you have to do single-handed firing with your non-dominant hand? Well, there were people that needed to do with one hand tasks that they'd normally do with 2. And all of those things become the exception that proves the rule. And there's a lot to be learned from it, just from the sheer volume of strange things that happened that day. Now, the next thing I want to cover is what did happen that day. I'm going to give you a very short version, and I want to hit the high points that I think are good points of discussion. If you really want the very long version, which I could go on for an hour about, but I don't really want to, there's sources you can get, there's books you can read, there's online sources, there's a multitude of YouTube videos, and I have not seen them all, but the ones I have seen left a lot to be desired, so pick your sources wisely. There's even a made-for-TV movie starring Ronnie Cox, Michael Gross, and David Soul, and it's called In the Line of Duty, The FBI Murders. It's a movie, and they have a lot of their details right. They've screwed up a couple of them, but if you don't want to get nitpicky about details, you just want a good big picture of what happened, it's actually a really good source, if you can put up with an hour and a half of David Soul. But let me give you a very condensed version. When most people tell this story, it starts with a car crash. Let me back up quite a ways from that. What was going on was that In the Miami-Dade area, for the most part up and down the Tamiami Highway, there were robberies that were occurring, armored cars, banks. And eyewitness reports are always conflicting, but the reports that were coming in had consistently that it was a two-man crew, that they were very aggressive, that one was armed with a pump shotgun, the other one had some kind of high-capacity semi-auto rifle, they weren't sure at the time what kind. And this was the information that was coming in. And the FBI is investigating this. In one of the robberies, the two-man crew shot, not fatally, but shot an armored car guard. In one of the robberies, they made their escape in a getaway car, which they abandoned and was later found. And it was discovered that the registered owner of that car had been reported missing some days earlier. He'd gone out into the Everglades, in a place where people typically go hunting or target shooting, and he didn't come home. He'd been reported missing. Well, a new search was mounted for him, and they found him. They came to the conclusion, a logical conclusion, that this two-man robbery crew had murdered him and taken his car. Well, a while after that, another guy goes out in that same area, and he gets shot and they take his car. Except he didn't die. He was rescued, he was able to tell law enforcement what happened. They came to the very logical conclusion that it's probably the same guys, and that was the real break in the case. Now they knew what kind of car to be looking for. Well, they had it in their minds that these people would hit in this like 2-day window, and so they had over 100 agents up and down this area, staking out banks, patrolling in unmarked vehicles, and one of them sees the suspect vehicle. They hadn't even changed the license plates. Well, he starts following the suspect vehicle, other FBI vehicles get into this little parade, they end up trying to do felony stop procedures. It results in a minor car crash and then a major shooting. Now, there were 8 FBI agents and 2 suspects there. But quite often when I talk about this, I will refer to it as 6 FBI agents shooting it out with 1 suspect. Why is that? Because of the 2 suspects, the one with the shotgun, yes, I know their names, I just choose not to say them. Shotgun suspect, according to the sources I've seen, only fired 1 shot in the entire ordeal and did not hit anyone with it. His entire participation was getting out of a vehicle and getting into another vehicle. It was the other suspect, Mini 14 suspect, that did all the damage. Now, for the 8 agents, one of them had a shotgun, and as he was running up to the fray, he got shot in the arm, severing the radius and the ulna, and it took him out of action. Now, he comes back into action later, but for right now, he's out of it. That puts us down to 7 agents. One of those agents lost his gun, and his participation was running away to the other side of the street to look for it. So that puts us basically with 6 agents shooting it out with 1 man. Now, there were some various things that went on, most of them simultaneously, and I want to cover a couple of those. Let me show you something. One of the agents, armed with a .357 Magnum revolver, was able to take cover behind the engine compartment of a car, not like this one, but a car, and use the hood as a supported position and fire his 6 shots. Let's take a look at the target. I fired 6 shots and got 6 hits, 3 in each target. Now, granted, I did not get shot in the hand like he did, and no one was shooting back at me, but I'm also shooting 8 times farther than he was. He fired 6 shots at a distance of about 8 feet, hitting shotgun suspect once. Then, while trying to reload with his wounded hand, trying to get his rounds in his revolver and dodging bullets, he wasn't able to get reloaded, got shot again, not fatally, but it took him out of the fight. Now, there was another agent with a .357 Magnum revolver, and I want to show you what happened with him. Now, there was another agent armed with a .357 Magnum revolver, and here's one of those parts where there is a little discrepancy in the story. Some accounts are that he lost his revolver, but I think the more accurate one is that he fired all 6 out of it. Then, instead of taking the time to reload, he reaches into his ankle holster and gets out his snub-nosed 5-shot .38 Special revolver. Then he charged the situation. Now, of all the failures that people can talk about that day, I'm going to have to say bravery was not one of them. He charged into this gunfight with a gun like this one. Well, he runs up and takes cover behind a car. Now, this time we won't use a car, I'll just use this bench. He ducks down behind the car, and he shoots 3 shots. Ducks for a second, comes back out, and shoots his last two, and then starts to reload. He pulls his loose ammunition out of his pocket, and while he's reloading, he gets shot in the hand and in the arm. Screws up his reload. The suspect charges him, shoots him again, not fatally, but took him out of action. Now the question I would ask there is, why didn't he have a speed loader? I absolutely know they existed at the time, and I'd have to wonder, why did he not have one? Now let's try that drill again, this time with a speed loader. Would that have been faster enough to make the difference? I don't know, but it sure couldn't have hurt. Now let's take a look at the target. So how'd we do? I fired 10 shots, got 9 hits. There's one flyer, that's just me. And I can make the excuse that I was trying to mimic the way he was shooting, not the way I would have held the revolver. And there's also, of course, the thing that no one was shooting back at me. But I am shooting about 5 times as far as he was. Now there were a lot of things going on more or less simultaneously. While those events were occurring, there was also an agent across the street who was using the hood of his vehicle as a stabilization platform while he fired a lot of rounds out of his 9mm, getting maybe one hit. There was another agent that had a 9mm with a 12-shot magazine, fired his 12, reloaded, fired his 12 for a total of 24 shots, again getting maybe one hit. And then before he could get his 3rd magazine in, he was shot and killed. There was another agent that was also firing a 9mm that scored the hit that's sometimes called the shot heard round the world, where the bullet entered the suspect's arm, missed the humerus, severed the brachial artery, entered the thoracic cavity, perforated the lung, and stopped just short of the heart. As I've said before, a certainly fatal wound without immediate medical intervention, but it was not an immediately disabling one. The suspect went on to fight for more than 3 more minutes. The whole thing took about 4 minutes. And while all this is going on, there came a point where pretty much all the agents were taken out of action, and the suspects were trying to make their escape. And here's where our wounded man with the shotgun comes back into action. Let me show you something. As the suspects tried to make their escape by stealing an FBI vehicle, one of the agents, armed with an .870 shotgun similar to this one, and having been shot in the arm, had to shoot his shotgun one-handed from around the vehicle he was hiding behind. Then after expending all 5 rounds, he advanced on the suspects with his .357 Magnum revolver. But before we do that, let's take a look at the target. And the ammunition I was using in this case was 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch double-aught buck 9 pellets, so 45 projectiles went downrange, and there's the result. And again, I'm shooting twice as far as he did at a target half the size. But there's a few things you have to take into consideration. That particular agent had been shot in the arm badly enough that he thought at that moment that his arm was going to have to be amputated. Also, he was shooting at 2 people that were in or getting into a car, so he could only see them from about so far up. In fact, his first shot was as the car door was open, and he shot at the suspect's foot below the open car door and hit the suspect in the foot. Then there's also the matter that I can't swear to it, but I don't think he had ever been trained on that one-hand technique. I think he made it up right at that moment. And when you take all of that into consideration, the marksmanship he was able to achieve was pretty good. And that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of what happened. Now we get into the part of my analysis of all of that. This case has always been a source of frustration for me, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that there are people that in their discussion of it focus on minutiae. For example, I was talking to somebody one day, and he tells me that he does not like Winchester Silvertip ammunition. Okay, well, I've had a lot of success with it. I've killed a couple of deer with Winchester silver tips. But I asked him why he doesn't like Winchester silver tips. And his answer was, quote, well, you know what happened to those FBI agents? 25 years after the event, and all he's gotten out of it is what he perceives as the failure of a type of ammunition that didn't penetrate enough. No thought on all the other things that were going on that may have affected the outcome, and it never occurred to him that just maybe in 25 years, Winchester has changed their silver tips a little bit. And this is the minutia that a lot of people focus on. There's other people that will try to use Miami-Dade as an example of whatever point they're trying to make when it really isn't an example of that. You'll hear people say how for concealed carry and self-defense purposes revolvers are inadequate because of their low magazine capacity. Most revolvers only hold 5 or 6. And he will use to illustrate that point that these FBI agents with revolvers were unable to solve the problem. Well, 6 FBI agents with revolvers shooting at one suspect is not really a good example of what you might incur in a self-defense shooting. Also, they didn't all 6 have revolvers. Some had auto-loaders. And you can see that there were a couple of them that fired many, many rounds and still didn't solve the problem. So should I be able to say that a 12-shot magazine is insufficient? It doesn't really illustrate the point that that guy's trying to make. Another thing is that there are people who will posit their opinions based on their ignorance of the events. Such as, there's people who will occasionally say, well, if they had had .357 Magnums instead of 9mm, then that would have solved the problem. Their hits would have been more effective. Well, a couple of them did have .357 Magnum revolvers. But there's a thing about the .357 Magnum that I want to make very clear. Let me show you something. A .357 Magnum revolver is a powerful handgun. Several of my crew members have gotten one-shot stops on deer with .357. .357 Magnum is powerful, but I am steadfastly of the opinion that it is virtually useless unless you hit what you're shooting at. And that's the real thing of my take on it, is that there were 2 major failures that day. First and foremost being a failure of marksmanship. Lots of people firing lots of rounds and not hitting anything. There was one agent that emptied 2 12-shot magazines and got maybe 1 hit. Now you keep hearing me say that maybe 1 hit. We know ballistically who fired the shot heard around the world, but the same suspect had another shot in his arm, and we're not really sure who fired that one. It was a through and through. So the man who fired 24 shots got maybe 1 hit. Why? We'll come back to that. But there were other people that fired a lot of shots and just didn't hit anything. And that was a major malfunction. Now, there were things that went right. As in, when they tried to pull these people over, they picked the right place to do it. Given what they had to work with, they figured that spot was where they had the least potential for collateral damage. And they were right. Over 100 rounds went downrange and no innocent bystanders were shot. The other thing they did right was a thing of bravery. You heard me mention that earlier. These people are getting out of their cars and running toward the fracas. Now, some of you are thinking about, what about the one man that ran away? This is where the story has changed a little over the years. Back in the late 1980s when we were learning about this, nobody called that man names. Today when we hear about this, some people will say he was a coward and he ran away. Okay, well the way the story goes is that he had taken his pistol out of his holster, stuck it on the seat next to him. And then as the cars started bashing together, his passenger door came open and his gun slid out the passenger door. Well, actually it didn't. It slid off the end of the seat and was stuck in the car. And then, a few seconds later, as the crash occurred, he ended up crashed right next to the suspect vehicle. And after the cars got stopped, he jumped out of his own car and ran away to look for his gun. And people say that was cowardly. Okay. Once he got stopped, he was taking fire from Mini 14 suspect before anybody even got out of the cars. As soon as he got his vehicle stopped, this is what he saw. And that's pretty much what that guy saw as soon as he got his car stopped. Gun lost or not, I think getting out of the line of fire was a really good idea. As I said before, bravery was not in short supply that day. The number one malfunction was a complete failure of marksmanship. Now the second thing was a failure of preparation. Now this takes a minute to explain, so bear with me. A while ago I did a presentation on my top 5 home defense guns, and somebody commented on that and saying that my idea of a home defense plan and preparing for what's more likely before what's least likely represented backward thinking. And it was backward thinking that got those FBI agents in trouble. Okay, looking at crime statistics and news stories about home invasions and burglaries for 2016, 2017, and then incorporating that into your home defense plan for 2018, 2019 is not looking backward. Looking backward is what gets our military in trouble. At the end of the First World War, the American military continued to train as if the next war would be just like that one. Well, in 1939 and 1940, as the Nazis were going across Europe in what would become the Second World War, they showed that the next war would be nothing like the First World War, and our military had to really quick change everything they were doing. That's backward thinking. Those agents that were there that day, I don't think they were thinking backward at all. And besides that, my video on home defense guns is hardly analogous to the FBI chasing down bank robbers. So I called that guy a few names, told him to get lost. But anyway, looking backward, I don't believe those agents were doing that, but perhaps they should have been. Now, we have to judge them by the standard of that which is known or should reasonably be known. That was the standard we lived with in the military. What did they know? They knew they were dealing with a 2-man crew, pump shotgun, high-capacity semi-auto rifle. They knew that these people had committed car theft, robbery, attempted murder, murder. These were some pretty serious people. Now, in terms of looking backwards, let's look back to the early 1930s when the FBI was rounding up a particular type of criminal called motor bandits. These were people that, using vehicles, would travel long distances, many jurisdictions, committing robberies and so forth with a lot more force than finesse. And you know some of their names: Ma Barker, Pierpont, Gillis, Floyd, Dillinger, and the list goes on. It became the bailiwick of the FBI to capture these people. And Melvin Purvis and his crew learned a lot of things the hard way in their dealing with them. When Melvin Purvis and his G-men went to Little Bohemia to try to capture the Dillinger gang, their intel was not that good. Their plan had a lot of holes in it. Their execution did not go the way they wanted it to, and the mission was basically a failure. But something they brought with them were shotguns and Tommy guns. When a sheriff's posse finally caught up with Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, Bonnie and Clyde, they had rifles and shotguns. One of those people had in fact hand-received from the National Guard Armory a BAR, a fully automatic open-bolt machine gun, caliber .30-06, which used 20-shot detachable box magazines. These people were not screwing around. There was a movie made sometime in the 1950s about the evolution of the FBI. And in the movie where they get to the part where the FBI becomes authorized to be armed, they depict them going to the range and learning to shoot and so forth. And there's a scene where an instructor hands a Tommy gun to one of the agents, and I can get the quote pretty close. He says, "Investigative techniques are fine, but for hoodlums, nothing beats a good machine gun." Oh, and by the way, as far as I know, the word is hoodlum, not hoodlum. Nothing beats a good machine gun. I know that. Melvin Purvis knew that, and those FBI agents there that day should have known that. Look at what they were dealing with, and they knew what they were getting into. Now, yes, there were a couple of MP5 submachine guns there that day, but those agents were not even close to the shooting when it occurred. A complete lack of preparation. Now, I said earlier that revolvers would have been adequate, given adequate marksmanship. But these guys didn't even have speed loaders, a lack of preparation. And it's not just about guns and ammo, it's about other things too. One of the agents that died that day was, by all accounts, a really serious pistol shooter. He was SWAT trained, he'd done a lot of stuff. I mean, this guy was the man. One of the other people there that day described him as someone who had spent his life preparing for that day. Okay, I have no doubt of that. then why is it when the shooting started that he emptied his 12-shot magazine, emptied another 12-shot magazine, and maybe got one hit? Because he wore very thick glasses and he'd lost them in the car crash. This represents a lack of preparation. With all the training and the guns and the ammo and the extra magazines, he had failed to invest in a 59-cent nerd strap to hold his glasses on. This is a lack of preparation. And that and a complete marksmanship failure is really what got them in trouble. Now, that having been said, there's one more thing I want to add. There's a segment of our population that's called the armchair commando, or the Monday morning quarterback, or these days we call them keyboard commandos. People that like to sit here and say what other people should have done. Well, it's very easy, with the leisure of years to think about it, to critique what other people did when they had seconds to decide on a course of action and then execute it. It's very easy to say what that person should have done, or the I would have whatever, when you've never really been in that situation. Let me tell you an anecdote that has nothing to do with this. Long time ago, a couple of people I knew came up with the cockamamie idea that they're going to go to British Columbia and swim with the killer whales. Well, they invited me to go along just because I was the only one that had a vehicle adequate to tow the boat they had to rent. Well, we got up there, and in part of the practice and preparation process for this, we're looking at a book. And there's a photograph in this book that shows some people kayaking, and like 5 feet from them is a whale swimming along next to them. And I made some comment like, wow, that's really cool, and you can just jump right out of the kayak and swim with the whale. One of these guys says, yeah, Paul, you say that now. Well, let's see what you do when you get there. Okay. Well, we went up there and we were in the boat for a couple of days, and this was really getting old, when finally, on day 3, here's the whales. And I see them about 300 meters away. I can see their dorsal fins. They're coming right at us. This is it. And I start taking off my t-shirt, and I'm starting to get my wetsuit on, and these other 2 guys aren't doing anything. Come on, guys, let's go. Well, one of them is sitting here, and I say, come on, get your gear on. And that's when he says, quote, well, something tells me that today is just not the day for me to get in the water. After giving me all this grief about what he would do and talking all this trash. And yes, that was Joe. No kidding, same guy. Anyway, my point is, it's very easy to say, I woulda this or they shoulda that, when you've never been on what we call a two-way live fire range. It's very easy to say all those kind of things when you've never been in a situation where you've got a second or 2 to make the shot, and if you don't make that shot, other people will die. It's very easy to critique in leisure what people had to do in haste. And I would ask everybody to take that into consideration before you judge the actions of these FBI agents very harshly.